Whether you're following along with our Tamarack Sew Along or want to make your own bias tape for another project, this tutorial is for you. In this lesson, I'll walk you through the steps involved in cutting and folding your own bias tape as we do here in the studio. If you have any questions, just let me know in the comments below. To begin, I want to discuss what bias tape is, but first let's go back one step further and talk about bias. Bias is any grain line that falls between the straight grain and cross grain of the fabric. When cutting bias tape, we'll be cutting our fabric along the true bias, which falls at a 45-degree angle to the cross and straight grains. Because bias cuts across the straight and cross grains, it's much stretchier without the full length of those threads to stabilize it. And this stretch makes bias binding perfect for rounding curves like necklines or finishing things like the Tamarack Jacket. Now, what turns bias into bias tape? We'll be cutting strips of fabric on the bias and folding them to create bias binding. Most patterns call for double fold bias binding, which means the fabric is folded twice to create the binding. This is in contrast to single fold binding, which is only folded once. You can see here in this image the difference between the two. Single fold bias can absolutely be used in place of double fold, but keep in mind, just make sure the tape will be the right size once you apply it to your finished project. Now that we know what bias binding is, let's talk about how to make it. I'll be walking you through two methods to create your bias strips in this tutorial. First, I'll be showing you the single strip bias method. This method is preferable when you need only a single strip of fabric, say for a bias finished neckline, or when working with a fabric that can't be cut into a square. For example, you're cutting bias strips out of the remnants of a fabric that's already been cut for your project. Another thing to keep in mind is although you're sewing more seams than with the second method I'll show you, you end up with less seams throughout your bias binding. To begin, we'll need to cut our bias strips. We'll be cutting along the true bias, which falls at a 45-degree angle from the selvage edge. Our end product in this tutorial is double fold bias tape with a 1/2 inch finished width, so we'll be cutting 2-inch wide strips. As a general rule for single fold bias binding, your strips should be 2 times as wide as the finished strip. For double fold bias binding, which we're going to need for the Tamarack, you want your strips to be 4 times as wide as the finished strip width. So here I have my rotary mat, my rotary ruler, and my rotary cutter. Lay out your fabric along your mat so the grain line is parallel to the lower edge. Then you're going to line up your ruler. You can see here we have a line that's the 45-degree bias. And we're going to cut a few strips along that line. Now again, we want 2-inch strips. You can see my ruler is not long enough to cut the entire width, so I'm just scooting it as I cut. So continue cutting so you'll have enough length for whatever you're binding after we join the pieces together. Now you can see on my bias strips, I have this colored selvage. I'm going to trim that off because I don't want that showing on my final garment. Now on the other side, I pre-washed my fabric, so we have a lot of fraying. I'm also going to trim that off. Make sure you're cutting that again on the bias because we do want these angled edges. Now we need to join our pieces together. Take the end of one strip and lay it face up. Then take the edge of another strip and lay it face down on top of the other strip so that the angled edges are aligned. We're going to be sewing this at 1/4 inch, so we want to make sure that the strips align like so, 1/4 inch in from the edge. You can see here it meets the point where the two strips cross. So that way when we sew our seam allowance, we'll have a straight line of bias. So you can put a pin or two in here. Then we're going to head over to our machine and we're going to sew this seam line. Now here we are at the machine. And instead of back tacking, I just like to change my stitch length so it's shorter than I would normally use. And stitch across. That way I don't have a back tack scrunching the ends in, and as I work, the seam stays put. So stitch across and trim your threads. After you've sewn this seam, you're going to press your seam allowances open. And then I like to trim off the triangles of seam allowance that overlap the bias strip. That way you reduce the bulk a bit while joining. Repeat these steps to join your strips together until you have the length you need for your project. The second method I'll be showing you is the continuous strip method. This method has you at the machine less, sewing 2 seams together rather than seaming each strip. But the way the fabric is joined, then cut, does result in more seams in the finished bias tape. So keep that in mind if that's something you dislike in your binding. You also will need a larger square of fabric to start with. To begin, you'll need to cut a square of the fabric you'll be using for your binding. In order to get enough tape for the tamarack, you'll need between a 25 to 27 inch square. Now cut the square in half diagonally along the 45-degree bias from corner to corner. Now we'll need to align 2 short ends of each triangle with the right sides together and pin. So to do that, take your outer edge here and flip it. And again, what we're going to do, just like we did for the other, is we want our edges to cross along our 1/4 inch seam allowance. So here you can see our 1/4 inch and our fabric crosses right along there. So that will ensure a straight line again once we press. So I'm just going to pin this together. That way it doesn't move while I'm sewing. And now head over to your machine and we're going to sew along this 1/4 inch seam line. Now here we are at the machine, and again we're going to just sew across our seam line with a smaller stitch length than normal so that we don't need to back tack, using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. here you can see how our seam line just meets the point where the two layers cross. Now using your ruler, you're going to mark 2-inch strips across the width of your bias piece. If you have any extra at the end, and it's less than 2 inches, or whatever the width of your bias strip is, we're going to trim that off. So here I'm using a pencil so you can see it. You would probably want to use something removable or that washes out. And here you can see on mine, we have this area here that's not 2 inches. So we need to cut that off. So just take your rotary ruler and your rotary cutter, trim and discard. We're taking this edge, we're bringing this corner up so it hits the first drawn line on the other edge. And you can see, yeah, it's pretty awkward. So we're going to be sewing this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we're going to shift the top layer to the left slightly so that the two lines cross 1/4 inch from the top edge. This will ensure that your lines still meet after the seam allowance is sewn. So here I'll draw a line with my pencil so you can see this edge. We want it to cross at that intersection point. That way when we sew, we have a straight strip. So pin that. And you're just going to work over, and each line you drew should align in the same fashion. Then when you get to the other side, we're going to have the same thing. So again, I'll draw this in so you can see. I'm going to align it. And you can see here the cut edge hits the intersection of the seam allowance and the bias strip. So pin. Then we're going to head over to our machine and we're going to stitch across there, again using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. All right, again, same thing as the others. We're using a smaller stitch length to secure our seam. And then just sewing straight across. So now we need to press our seam allowance open, and if you have a sleeve roll or a ham, you're going to want to insert that in there. It'll just be the easiest way to press the tube. Just start. And work your way across. now we have something that looks like this. Here you can see how our strips align one right into the next on that line we drew in. Now all we need to do is start cutting. So we're just going to take our scissors and cut along the lines you drew. Until your entire piece is cut. Make sure you don't cut the layer underneath, just the top layer. You can see we're just cutting right across that seam we sewed, and that is why using the smaller stitch length comes in handy. We don't want the ends to unravel as we work. And there we've reached the end. So we now have one long piece of bias binding, and it only took 2 seams. Now here is what I'm talking about with having more seams. You will have some of these smaller seams in your binding with this method. If that's fine with you, then go for it. If you prefer less seams, you might want to consider the first method we talked about. Now we need to fold our bias tape into binding. This is going to be the same no matter which method you use to create your strips. You can apply your binding now without folding it, but it can be nice to have a pre-folded bias strip with the creases for stitching lines already in it. Head over to your ironing board with your bias strip and bias tape maker. Grab some glass head pins and plug in your iron. With the wrong side of the bias strip facing up, feed the end through the bias tape maker. So here you can see, you just put it in and start feeding it through. Ours came out really nicely, but if it doesn't, you can take your pin and use this slot here to feed it through. Pull about 1 inch through the maker and anchor the end with a pin. Now slide the bias tape maker backwards as you move your iron forwards over the newly folded fabric to set the folds. Continue until you reach the end of your bias strip. You now have a 1/2 inch single fold piece of bias tape. To make double fold bias tape, we now need to make the second fold. Simply fold the edges of the bias tape together and press to create the final fold. Again, continue pressing until your entire strip is pressed in half. You can use your bias tape right away or wind it onto a piece of cardboard to stay neat for later use. I'll be using this double fold bias binding for the Tamarack Sew Along, but it's also great for finishing necklines, hems, and more. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope this video has helped you step up your bias binding game. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed to our channel so you don't miss any of our video updates or lessons. Next up in the Tamarack Sew Along, we'll be inserting our welt pockets and assembling and attaching our patch pockets. So I'll see you back here for that. In the meantime, happy sewing! Bye-bye.